Hi, I'm Jason. I've had successes and what I felt like were epic failures. At each point, it was the people I walked with and learned from who helped me through. On my podcast, What Works, I interview authors, educators, executives, and people who work to change the world. I walk for a moment on their journey and learn from them. For me, that's what works. Jason, and I help create meaningful, measurable solutions for organizations that change the world. I've made it easy to stay connected. Listen to the What Works with Jason Todd podcast, where I interview authors, educators, and fellow world changers. Follow me on LinkedIn and YouTube for resources and live events. Engage me to advise you or your business, or book me to speak. Learn more at therealjtodd.com. And now, today's event.
Well, we are live here on LinkedIn, YouTube, and on Facebook here today with Greg Githens, a friend of mine, and also the author of How to Think Strategically. I'm just going to throw up a quick ad for his book. We've got a mastermind group starting on October 1st. How to Think Strategically is a book with some things that he talks about are micro skills. And we're going to be unpacking those today in context of resilience. So everybody today is going to walk away with something that we feel is, something that you can think about and in ways to unpack your experience in your business and your life, and ways to grow, to become better individuals for each other, and better individuals, I think, for ourselves. Last time we talked, I think it was like 2 weeks ago, we had to cancel last week. I actually ended up with COVID, which is an experience I would not want to repeat. But I think it's very timely for today's discussion on resilience, because we're talking about, how do you deal with things when they don't go the way you want it? And when we titled this thing, I put the navigating to normal in quotes, because what is normal and how does that work? So I'll give a quick introduction to me, Jason Todd. You saw a little bit about me on the pre-roll for this. You can find more information about me at therealjtodd.com. One of the things I love to do is I love to talk with smart people who move me forward in my life and my experience. And today's smart person is Greg Githens. You can find more about him at strategicthinkingcoach.com. But again, author of How to Think Strategically. And so we're going to be chatting about that. Greg, anything you want to say as we introduce this topic today?
Oh, I think resilience is going to be the word of the year for 2020. It just, I watch for it in my news feeds, and it pops up in articles in the New York Times and all over the place. So I think it's quite a word. I also think it's a misunderstood idea. I think a lot of people confuse it with perseverance. And I hope one of the things that we'll get at is just kind of broaden your understanding what resilience is and the many different ways that it expresses itself in the world.
Yeah. Now, this mastermind group that we've got starting up a week from now, if anybody wants more information on that, you can certainly email me. I'll go ahead and put a link down at the bottom. Email Jason at therealjtodd.com, and I can get you some specifics on that. But it's 14 weeks, a deep dive into Greg's book, How to Think Strategically. One of the things that we want to work towards is not only our growth as individuals, but our growth with each other. And as part of that mastermind group, what we're going to be doing is going through some learning sessions. Those will happen every other week. And then between the learning sessions, we're going to have an opportunity of sharing. So we want to understand and help you unpack through good questions what your experience is as you apply the principles from the book and the micro skills that Greg talks about. So if you want any more information on that, again, just shoot me an email, jason@therealJtodd.com. We'll put that up periodically during our discussion. But we've allocated maybe a half hour to this discussion today, and it's around the lunchtime. In this crazy time, I think everybody's, what's the word, unprecedented. The unprecedented times of COVID, which is a global disaster. Let's say it's a global war that we're fighting.
Yeah.
And whether you're on one side of it, we shouldn't shut down, or on the other side, we should shut down, or anywhere in between, the hyper reality is we are exactly where we are. So what are we going to do about it as individuals? Now, Greg, you've had the opportunity to talk about resilience, and I love how you say today, the word for the year is resilience. What are you experiencing as you talk to people globally, and how are you helping people process through this?
Yeah. Well, it comes out in a lot of different ways, and I'm not the only consultant in the world that's sensed a little bit of opportunity in that. And there's resilience coaches out there and so forth. I'll tell you the thing that really is capturing a lot of people's attention. This is especially people who are leaders of organizations, the top bosses and things. And I've been saying to them, we don't want to bounce back, we want to bounce forward. And they have found that when they take and internalize that message, and when they bring it out to their organizations, people are saying, I like that idea. I like that idea of getting stronger and thriving, as opposed to just going back to the way things were. So I think a lot of people are sensing within this a lot of opportunity, but then it's confusing because it's hard to know what exactly this opportunity looks like. So I guess if there would be one takeaway to kind of start with, is to start to think about bounce forward, where we're bouncing forward into the future that we may not understand. And one of the things that I like to encourage people to do is to expect emergence, expect novelty. This was called, before it was called COVID-19, it was called the novel coronavirus.
Yeah.
And I think this is one thing that, for strategic thinkers, this sensitivity to novelty, things that haven't been seen before, is one of the compelling strengths that a good strategic thinker can bring to that. Now, I'll say one more thing about this bounce forward, and just envision a tennis ball, or any kind of ball being bounced off the surface. The bounciness of that ball is a function of its physical resilience. The more it compresses and expands and goes in some sort of way, that's how a physicist would think about resilience. So it's the kind of the impact of something, and I usually think in terms of trauma when I'm thinking about people or organizations, but there's some sort of thing that happens to us, and then we respond to it, and that response goes by the name of resilience.
And this is something I think that some people maybe learn earlier on in their lives. You talk about this idea of trauma and being able to bounce back. Some people experience trauma early on, and then some people don't maybe have the opportunity to develop some of this resilience because they don't go through experiences. Their lives are generally, easy, quote unquote easy. Yeah. What do you see in folks who have not experienced events where they needed to be resilient?
They probably feel especially surprised when things don't go the way that they expect. They've been kind of sheltered and cloistered away. So I like to think about it a lot like the way you might in exercising and weightlifting and just trying to build some muscles. When you're lifting weights, you're making these small tears in the fibers of your muscle, micro tears, I think they're called. And then your body heals and you become stronger, and you gain more bulk and more strength in your muscle. And I think there's a very good analogy between resilience and that people who have been tested, and we've all been tested, let's be honest about this.
Yeah.
People who have been tested and have worked their way through the test naturally start to build some resilience. Where it's really a problem in people's lives is when you take young children who, are pulled away from their mothers or traumatized or something. It's really hard to for them to overcome some of the hurt and the pain of their very early childhood life. So, this just kind of off as a tangent. As a society, if there's one place that we want to be looking at, we need to be looking at traumatized children and try to make it easier on them. The good news for those of us in adulthood is the older you get, I think the more resilient you tend to be. So it's just really when you're at a kind of vulnerable age is at the time that you really kind of get sideswiped by all of that.
Well, one of the things I think that we have a keen eye on, and one of the things we're discussing in today and also in that upcoming mastermind group is being strategic about developing the skills of resilience. Because it's one thing to have something happen to you and then go, oh my God, you have to react to develop resilience. And it's an entirely different thing to start putting skills in place and practicing them so that when something comes upon you, you have a plan in place for it. And that's, you brought up this idea of a chief resilience officer as we were chatting right before our broadcast. And I was like, well, that's kind of a neat way to look at organizations or communities by giving the responsibility to somebody. How are we going to be resilient? And that I think it begins with us. It's personal responsibility. What do you think about that?
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting idea. Of course, there's a chief X officer of so many different things. There are, in fact, chief resilience officers that work for many city and state governments. And their primary concern has been around coastal flooding. So you actually, go out and Google chief resilience officer, you'll find examples of them out there. But I would like to take and broaden that idea. This is just a suggestion, and I do not know of anybody out there that's actually doing this, but I think it's a great idea, of course, is that if we had a chief resilience officer for a business, they would be concerned about things like business continuity. They would be concerned about things like environmental sustainability. And they'd certainly be concerned about things like health and wellness within their workforces and trying to develop resiliency competencies within their very own workforce. I think what we'll see in the coming 10 years, just one of my predictions, is that we're going to see an increasing movement towards designing the organization for resiliency. I think what we're leaving behind is the idea of designing for efficiency. Because one of the things the pandemic has shown us is that these supply chains and these efficient things that we put together actually are pretty brittle and breaking apart. So if we instead ask the question, rather than how do we make our organizations more efficient, we ask the question, how do we make our organizations more resilient? And then I think there's a lot to be talking about. Okay, so what is resilience anyways?
I think that's a really great insight that organizations we're built for efficiency. And now, like you talked about, we are much more fragile and brittle than we understood, right? Nobody's keeping an eye on that, and yet there are pockets of society that and academia that have kept an eye on these things like war games, or they war game an outbreak, a global outbreak. They've war gamed these things, but nobody talks about it. Because maybe it's just for an enlightened academic mind or something like that. And the rest of us just kind of blissfully ignore things and assume that they will just continue in relatively easy fashion. And I think that's kind of a generational thing. I don't think that was true 100 years ago when life was maybe a bit harder for a lot of folks. So transitioning our organizations from efficiency to how are we going to be resilient and change. It's been proven over time that organizations that can weather change, can continue on, and those that are unable to change, don't. So what practical skills, and maybe that's not a fair way to term it, this practical, but what skills and what ways of thinking should we be applying? And do you have in your book that are the skills of resilience?
Yeah. One of the things that I started putting together when the pandemic hit and I found a lot of people were asking me about resilience is I keep going back to the micro skills. So let me just do a real quick review for those of you that aren't familiar. There are 20 micro skills of strategic thinking. And what I like to recommend people do is they go through the one micro skill per week, just really kind of practicing it and moving on to the next one. And you do that on a 20-week cycle. And they're many of them are very, very easy. For example, curiosity, reflection. Courage is a little bit bolder one, but courage is something that's certainly important to resilience. I think a lot of people are drawn back into nostalgia instead of wanting to leaning into the future and leaning into the bouncing forward because they don't have the courage. They're more interested in conforming with the established norms and kind of fitting in rather than taking on the risk that, I might stand out and I might be a little bit different. So the micro skill of courage is one that's important there. Sometimes it is scary to be a strategic thinker because people are looking at you and saying, you look at things a little bit differently, and that must mean you're odd, a little bit strange.
Yeah.
Another one is in reframing, and reframing is the kind of looking at things from a different situation, trying to understand the other person's story of what happened. Sometimes we abstract and just look at the generalities, but we try to look at it at different points of view. And that's certainly a key part of resilience. Because one thing that happens when people are traumatized, and that's key to understanding what resilience is a response or an anticipation of a trauma. Some people say, oh, this always happens to me. God's got me in his sights to make my life miserable. And they just take it and internalize it and become victimized. A reframing is, this is an opportunity to grow. This is an opportunity to learn something. And that's a lot of times what therapists are doing with people who have felt a lot of anxiety in the past and don't have a lot of resilience, is they're helping to reframe a story of victimization into some sort of story of growth. Underneath all of this is this growth mindset and a growth attitude. So those are a couple more of the micro skills that enhance resilience. And actually, personal resilience itself is one of those 20 micro skills. So we ask you to take a week and reflect upon your life and reflect on some of the things that haven't gone so well. Last time we spoke, I talked about the trauma inventory, and that basically is to review your life in 7-year increments and say to yourself, what's the worst thing that happened to me during that 7-year period? And what you'll find is that as you get older, you become a lot more resilient.
One of the things that comes to my mind is the maybe mistaken tendency to believe that personal development is just us in a vacuum, reading a book, attending a seminar, something like that, and we personally develop ourselves, and denying somehow the necessity, I think the radical importance of who we align ourselves with as part of our personal development.
Yeah,
I think what's the saying? We become the average of the 5 people we hang around with.
That's a good point.
We are drawn to the other people in our vicinity, and so we have to choose. I read something from Warren Buffett today, and one of his points was, be very careful about who you choose as your friends, and make sure those friends are always pulling you forward, instead of just choosing, the friends because they're fun to hang out with. But
yeah,
where does this idea of aligning ourselves with other people fit into this idea of resilience, and then also the process of thinking strategically?
Yeah. Well, that's something interesting I haven't thought before. So it's always great to talk to you, Jason, because you bring new ideas my way. And that's not a question I've ever been asked or really given a whole lot of thought. I agree with you. You take the 5 people that you are friends and are around a lot, and their good qualities rub off of you. They can lift you up. They can bring you down. And perhaps a thought would be is to look around at the resilience of the people that are part of your close friends and family, and just ask them. It's a learning opportunity. How have you been resilient in the past? What can I learn from you about overcoming adversity? And also then to your question, you could broaden it out. Associate yourself with other strategic thinkers. And what can I learn from you about good strategy versus bad strategy and strategic thinking to do that along? I've always felt that it's really important to have a thinking partner. And I think this is especially true for any of you that are working on organizational strategy, because maybe you see some small detail that they can't see. You can bring that detail, say, listen, hey, I'm going to tell you something. It might sound a little crazy, but the other day I noticed this, and it just was really curious, and it was really interesting to me. Do you see some of the implications of that? Did you see it as well? And they might say, yeah, I did, and that was fantastic. Or, no, that was just kind of silly, and or vice versa. But what's underneath this thinking partnership idea is the idea of trust, of being able to get with a person who sees things differently, but you can share the differences. Because again, as I said a little bit ago, strategic thinkers are often unorthodox, unconventional, that they see the world a little bit differently. And sometimes we might see things wrongly. And so it's good also to have someone give me a reality check and say, well, whatever you saw over there that seems so exciting and important to you, I'm sorry, I can't see it. And even if I could see it, I'm not sure what the value is. It's a good point, Jason.
Yeah, Jay, so we've got some people who are responding in the chat on LinkedIn, which is fantastic. Jay talks about resilience has come from several examples, but one of the examples that comes from is from his father and his grandfather's influence. And this idea of generational resilience, and that's kind of where my mind leads into.
Mm-hmm.
We learn resilience from one another by seeing it demonstrated. When we see someone else who is resilient, we're like, oh my gosh, where'd that come from? Mm-hmm. And we start, I think, number one, we begin to believe that we can be resilient, which I think is hugely important, because we don't ever do something we believe we can't do. And I've
Mm-hmm.
challenged people to flip the script from I can't do that. I say, shut up. Of course you can. I don't tell them shut up, right? Because that's not nice. But but sometimes we got to talk to ourselves like that. Say, no, shut up. That's not the script. I haven't yet done that. I don't know how to do that, but I can. And so, So this idea of beginning, yes, of course we can become resilient. Maybe we have not been resilient in the past, but we can be. And that unleashes us into accepting from other people and watching and being curious about how are they being resilient? And then being, I think, deliberate, very strategic, not to overuse that word, but very strategic about applying certain principles that give us a leg up, that move us forward more quickly than if we were to just, sit back and, kind of take things as they are and learn slowly. I think we can speed this up.
Yeah, that's a really great point. So let me just add to that. Thanks, Jay, for bringing that up. One thing that you can do to cultivate your own sense of resilience is a little bit of genealogy research. What do you know about your forefathers and the kinds of trials and tribulations they went through? Here in the United States, we're mostly a land of immigrants, and many of our forefathers underwent a lot of adversity. It had to overcome it. And the more you can appreciate that, if you know your ancestor's story, you can draw some strength from that story. If they overcome a far worse situation than you've ever experienced, you find within yourself the confidence and the life force to go out and just persevere and keep pushing against those obstacles that are ahead of you. That's such a great point. We getting any other comments there?
Yeah, I'm reading another one here. For me, resilience is coming to terms with the obstacles we have to deal with and face them with positivity, hope, patience, and gratitude. Yeah, so positivity, hope, patience, and gratitude are the things that this individual talks about. The word that came to my mind actually before we started talking was the word hope.
Yeah.
Because I think underscoring this idea of resilience is that we all want to deal in the currency of hope.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also the other saying that hope is not a strategy. Believing that tomorrow is going to be different just because we believe it is not true. But or better, let's say. But when we have some hope, that unleashes us to apply ourselves to making ourselves better and growing out of our circumstances when we don't like those circumstances.
Yeah. I like to encourage people to say, when you feel hope, what is the source of your hope? Where does that come from? But also an equally good question is, when you feel despair, what is the source of your despair? As we're talking about leaning into the future and bouncing forward, we have utopian and dystopian scenarios, and it's hard to know which one, but we know it's going to be different. That might be the normal. It's just simply, it's different. So this takes us back to that micro skill of anticipation and asking about our anticipatory assumptions. When you think about the future, certainly you feel some hope, but perhaps you feel some despair. And as you kind of back your way out of the source of your hope and your despair, you get a better insight about what's important to you. You get a better set of criteria for making the decisions that you make today, because obviously the decisions we make today bear their consequences into the future.
Yeah, I was watching. I was recently watching a World War II in color. It's on Netflix, and I did a terrible job in history class in high school. I just couldn't keep track of the specifics of all the dates. But along the arc, I always love the storyline of history. And one of the things that comes to my mind is that if I were to contrast my life with what people experienced, let's say 80 years ago, these experiences are remarkably different. And the resilience that is required to go into some of these global battles, I mean, remarkable, to live with that resilience and have it baked in. I think baked in, right? Like pottery, right? You have pottery, but then you have to put it into the fire. You have to bake it in at hundreds of degrees to have it become strong. And we are I think very much similar to that. We need to allow ourselves to go through that fire, and I think the whatever we've armed ourselves with, however we've made that clay, right, or allowed us to be made into, right, that then becomes hardened. And I think that's along the lines of resilience, these principles that we can apply to ourselves. And then when we go through these experiences that challenge us, we become firm in our beliefs. We become and we survive instead of becoming brittle and falling apart.
Yeah. So it goes back to being tested. To put yourself at some edge of risk where you don't know how things will work out. And you can do that by choice, but sometimes life just pushes you there, regardless, that you're out there and you have to make a decision not knowing what things are going to work out.
Yeah.
But usually they do work out. And so it's the courage to make a decision. And I would advise everyone it's that you want to be leaning into the future instead of being drugged back into nostalgia to the good old days, because the good old days were never that good to begin with. Lean into the future, which is the micro skill of anticipation. Try to see the world in a different kind of way. And then deep inside of you, you have the confidence that we'll figure this out. We will find a way. And I can't do it all by myself, but we can do it collectively together. And I think this is one of the reasons why we want to look at the collective resilience of an organization. And then to the concept of strategic thinking, we don't want to have just one strategic thinker in the organization. We want to have a large cadre of people who can think strategically, who can have high quality conversations with each other, who can talk about some of those strange, weird, odd kind of things, but yet have a productive conversation about where are we going and what might happen and how do we make the best choices in the present, knowing that their consequences will bear out in a different way in the future.
Yeah. Well, as we close up this broadcast, I'm thinking, so from a day-to-day process standpoint, this idea that if you want different results, you got to change the process or you got to change the data. Mm-hmm. In terms of a process that people can begin applying, what is a skill that you might recommend people start applying over the next week? And then I think, as using the Ben Franklin example, we're going to work on one skill per week to allow that skill to become manifested in our experience. What's a skill that comes out to you that might be timely for today for people?
Okay, well, this is just the first one that comes to my mind, and it's maybe not a really easy one, but I think it's got a lot of power behind it. And I had a CEO client of mine ask me not long ago. He goes, "Greg, I've heard that you don't want to let a crisis go to waste, and I don't want to let this crisis go to waste for my organization. So what should I do?" And my advice was to go back and challenge assumptions about the way things work. Challenge your assumptions about what's true and correct and best practice and valuable in today's state. Kind of pull yourself away from that and just challenge that a little bit. So I think if we want to not let that crisis go to waste, it's really to say, are we believing things to be true that are no longer true or no longer relevant? And that's what I would encourage all of you to do in the coming week, is just to spend a little time looking at mental models and looking at assumptions and challenge them. Yeah.
That in and of itself is challenging, I think.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, like I said, it's not an easy one.
I think the radical introspection of being able to consider that one's belief systems are not serving one well anymore.
Yeah.
It may have been built on faulty ground to begin with, or at least need to change. You know, maybe the sun has moved, and we need to kind of face ourselves to the sun like a plant.
Yeah.
That's something to work on.
Yeah, it's different. But here's one thing that I'll offer in hope. You know, some people say, well, that's kind of scary to me, and I offer this to you. No one needs to know you're thinking strategically.
Okay.
You know, if you have a trusted, confident colleague that you can talk with about things that are heretical, unorthodox, out of the ordinary, that's a great friendship, and that's a great asset that you have. Because we've got, as I said earlier, we've got to do this together, but we've got to look at things differently and try to see the world best that we can more clearly.
Yeah. And that's something that, you know, as I'm thinking through, you know, the structure of this mastermind and what we want to achieve is not only that individual insights for ourselves, real work that we each need to do that only we can do, but then align ourselves with other people who are working towards these same goals, applying them in a slightly different way, and having different experiences that we can feed back into one another. Because I believe it is the collective experience that when aligned together actually builds the strength, right? It's not one thread, it's the many threads that come together that build the fabric. And that I think is so important. And again, like we talked about, underlooked, that we want to align ourselves to people who are headed in the same direction of personal growth and corporate growth.
Yeah. An appreciation of diversity too. You know, not a whole bunch of people all who look alike and think alike. Diversity, and that's a characteristic of ecosystems. They are diverse.
Yeah.
New things emerge.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as we close it out here, anything else you want to tell people before we wrap it up?
I think we've had a really good conversation, and let's just try to end on a high note. Certainly, I hope that you'll join us in the masterclass and be part of this conversation. I want to learn from you. I know Jason does as well. We want to learn from you, and we want you to learn from each other. So it's just not one sage on the stage making pronouncements, but it's also guides on the side that having good, high quality conversation, again, learning from each other, I think is one of the neat things about doing this mastermind.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have more, we've got more people funneling into that chat as we close up here. We want to just be respectful of everybody's time. And we don't want to get boring, which is always the risk, right? You can only look at these beautiful faces so long. 30
minutes is about enough.
But again, we want you to, if you're ready to invest in yourself, and I know that's the pitch everybody talks about. I've heard it a million times before too, but those of us who have gone through this work, the work that we do for ourselves, man, it's life-changing. So this is the opportunity to invest in yourself, or if you know somebody else, pass it along. Greg's book, How to Think Strategically, you can find that at therealjtodd.com. There's a link there for you. And also that mastermind group, it's coming up on October 1st. If you want information on that, shoot me an email, jason@therealjtodd.com, or just send me an instant message on LinkedIn or your favorite platform. I'll get back to you. But Greg, thanks so much again for joining me, brother. I trust that from the feedback that we're getting here on the LinkedIn channel, people have got things that they're struggling with, and also insights that they're ready to give into this global community. So thanks everybody for following us. Hit me up on LinkedIn, hit me up on YouTube, talk to Greg at strategicthinkingcoach.com, and we will chat with you soon. Thanks everybody.
Yeah.